The elevator doors opened onto the 61st floor at 3:12 a.m., and Amara Chidinma stepped into a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She wasn't supposed to be here. The executive penthouse of Kong Tower was cleaned between 1 and 2. But her supervisor had added the floor without warning, and now she stood in the dark with a mop and 4 more hours still left on her feet. She didn't know the man who owned this floor, this tower, was standing in his kitchen, watching her. Kong Jinho hadn't turned on the lights. He rarely did anymore. He had come home from a board meeting that ended in a screaming match and poured a drink he wouldn't finish. Then he heard it. A low, unguarded voice humming in the dark. It wasn't just the tune that stopped him. It was the words. She was singing in Korean, an old lullaby his grandmother used to hum when the rest of the house was asleep. The kind no foreigner should have known. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world tonight, drop your city in the comments. And if quiet stories about secrets, late nights, and the people who weren't supposed to meet keep you listening, hit subscribe. Because this one is going to ask a lot of you before it's through. Amara didn't notice him at first. She was too tired, too far inside her own head, running the math of rent and remittances and the second job she needed but didn't have the hours for. The lullaby had slipped out of her without permission, the way old things do when the body is too worn down to keep them locked away. It had been her father's song. He used to hum it while he fixed the radios of half the neighborhood in Itaewon, back when she was a girl who belonged to 2 worlds and hadn't yet learned that the world only wanted to claim one of them. She turned toward the hallway with her mop and nearly screamed. He was simply there. Tall, still, unreadable. A shape cut out of the darkness with eyes that had already seen too much of the day to be surprised by anything else in it except, apparently, her. Who let you up here? His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who had spent a decade learning not to react. I cleaned this floor, sir. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were home. Her hand had gone instinctively to the cart, to something solid, the way hands do when the rest of the body wants to run. You were singing. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to disbelief. I didn't mean to disturb you. That song. He took 1 step closer, and in the low light from the city outside, she saw something crack open in his face, something that didn't belong on the face of a man photographed on magazine covers with a jaw made of stone. Where did you learn that song? And because exhaustion strips away the instinct to lie, because 3 a.m. has a way of making truth easier than performance, Amara answered him honestly, in Korean, with the accent of someone who had once belonged to this language the way she belonged to her own name. He did not say anything for a long moment. Security would be called eventually. That was the story security would later tell each other, laughing, not knowing what they were laughing about. But right now, in this moment, Kong Jinho was not thinking about protocol. He was thinking about the fact that a stranger standing in his kitchen at 3 in the morning, mop in hand, uniform 2 sizes too large, had just reached into the one part of him he thought no one alive still had access to. Say it again, he said quietly. The song. All of it. She should have refused. Every part of her training told her to apologize and leave. But something in his voice, not command, but need, made her lower the mop, close her eyes and sing. When she opened them, he was watching her like a man watching something he couldn't yet name. And neither of them knew that this exact moment, this exact accident, was about to unravel every carefully built wall both of them had spent years constructing. Amara had come to Korea when she was 11, brought by a father who believed the country owed him a second chance after the first one, in Lagos, had collapsed under debt and disappointment. Her mother had stayed behind, promising to join them once there was enough money, a promise that dissolved slowly over years into silence and then into nothing at all. Her father worked 3 jobs and slept 4 hours a night until his heart simply stopped keeping time with the rest of him. And Amara, 17 and alone in a country that had never fully decided whether it wanted her, learned to disappear into invisibility as a survival skill. She spoke the language flawlessly. She understood the customs, the unspoken rules, the particular loneliness of being fluent in a place that still saw her as foreign the moment she stepped outside her door. And when the money for university evaporated along with her father's savings account, she took whatever work would have her, which meant, eventually, a mop and a badge that let her into buildings where people like Kong Jinho lived lives she could not imagine. She did not tell him any of this that first night. She told him nothing more than her name, and he told her nothing at all, and when the door closed behind her, she stood in the elevator shaking, certain she would be fired by morning. She was not fired. Instead, 3 days later, her supervisor informed her, with visible confusion, that the owner of the building had specifically requested that the new girl continue cleaning the executive floor, and that her schedule was being adjusted, earlier hours, better pay, no explanation given. Amara told herself it meant nothing. Rich men were unpredictable. This was simply one more strange decision in a world full of them. But the following week, she found a small, unmarked box of tea waiting on the kitchen counter of his penthouse, the same brand her father used to drink, a brand so specific and so discontinued that she hadn't seen it in 8 years. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Someone had been listening far more closely than a single overheard lullaby should have allowed. If this story is already pulling something out of you, that ache of being seen by someone who has no reason to look that closely, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And let's see how many countries show up in this thread by the end of the video. Kong Jinho had built his life on the principle of control. He controlled his company, his image, his family's expectations, and most importantly, the small, sealed compartment where he kept the memory of his grandmother, the only person who had ever loved him without calculating what that love might be worth later. She had died when he was 19, in the same month his father forced him into the company his grandfather built. And Jinho had spent the following 15 years becoming exactly the kind of man his family wanted: untouchable, efficient, alone. He did not date. He did not confide. His board members respected him, and his family feared him, and neither group had ever heard him laugh. And yet here he was, rearranging a cleaning schedule for a woman whose name he'd had to look up in the building's employee records, telling himself it was simple curiosity, knowing, somewhere beneath the lie, that it wasn't. He began finding reasons to be home when she cleaned. He began finding reasons to speak to her, a question about a family recipe, a comment about the weather that neither of them cared about, small bridges built out of nothing because neither of them was ready to name what they were building toward. Amara, for her part, told herself this was simply what wealthy, isolated men did when they were bored, and she was careful, so careful not to mistake his attention for anything more than a rich man's passing curiosity about an employee who reminded him of something he'd lost. She had learned young that hope was expensive and she couldn't afford the interest payments. But then came the night of the gala. Jinho's mother, Madame Seo, had spent decades constructing the illusion that her son's life was as controlled as his business decisions, and the annual Kong Foundation Gala was the stage on which that illusion performed best. It was also, unfortunately, the night the building's event staff were short 2 servers, and the agency that supplied Amara's cleaning contract also, as it happened, supplied catering staff for events exactly like this one. She should never have been in that ballroom. But there she was, in a black uniform, carrying a tray of champagne past 300 of the wealthiest people in Seoul, when Kong Jinho, mid-conversation with a shipping magnate twice his age, turned and saw her across the room and for one unguarded second, forgot to finish his sentence. His mother noticed. Madame Seo noticed everything. "Who is that girl?" she said afterward, in the quiet, dangerous voice she used instead of shouting. "And why does my son look at her like she's the only person in this building?" Jinho denied it, of course. He was good at denial. It was practically the family trade. But that night, walking Amara to the service elevator because he could not bear to let her walk alone through a parking garage at 1 a.m., he stopped her with a hand that hovered just short of touching her arm. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice had none of its usual armor. "That first night. The song. It wasn't just a song to me." "I know," Amara said quietly. "I could see that on your face. My grandmother used to sing it. She's the only person who ever." He stopped, jaw tightening, the old training reasserting itself, the 15 years of learning not to finish sentences that made him vulnerable. "Whoever what?" Amara asked, and something in her voice, not pity, never pity, but a kind of fierce gentleness, undid the last of his resistance. "Whoever made me feel like I wasn't just useful," he said. "Like I wasn't just a name on a building. And you did that in 90 seconds, standing in my kitchen with a mop, without even trying." Amara felt something crack in her own chest, something she'd bricked over the day her father died. And for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because some truths don't need narration, they only need two people standing close enough in the dark to feel them. If you've ever been seen like that, really seen, not for what you can offer someone but for who you actually are underneath the exhaustion, I want you to like this video right now, because that feeling, rare as it is, deserves to be honored, and this story is about to test exactly how far that feeling can survive collision with the real world. The real world arrived 3 days later in the form of Madame CO, standing in the doorway of the staff break room with the particular stillness of a woman who has already decided your fate and is simply waiting for the formality of the conversation to catch up. "You will resign," she told Amara, without preamble, without raising her voice, because women like Madame CO had learned that quiet threats landed harder than loud ones. "You will resign, you will take the severance I am prepared to offer, and you will never contact my son again." "I haven't done anything wrong," Amara said, and her voice shook, but it did not break. "You haven't had to. My son is not a man who falls carelessly. That is precisely the problem." Madame CO's eyes moved over her, cataloguing, dismissing. "He built himself into a fortress because the alternative destroyed his grandmother's health and nearly destroyed mine. I will not watch him hand the last unguarded piece of himself to a cleaning girl who will be gone the moment the money runs dry. I'm not after his money. Everyone says that." Madame CO's smile had no warmth in it at all. "The interesting ones say it and mean it. But meaning it changes nothing about what happens to my son's reputation, his shareholders' confidence, and this family's standing, when the tabloids discover that Kong Jinho is infatuated with a maid. You will be a headline for a week and a scandal for a decade. He will not survive that as easily as you imagine." Amara left the building that day without her final paycheck, without a reference, and without telling Jinho why. She told herself it was protection for him, for his company, for the fragile, complicated thing that had grown between them without either of them agreeing to plant it. She told herself a lot of things that week, most of them lies dressed up as wisdom. Jinho found out 3 days later, when he arrived home to find a stranger cleaning his floor and no one able to explain where Amara had gone. It took him 4 hours and one very uncomfortable conversation with HR to learn what his mother had done, and when he did, something in him, something that had spent 15 years being patient, being controlled, being exactly what everyone needed him to be, finally broke. He went to his mother's house that night for the first real argument they had ever had. "You had no right," he said. "I had every right. I am protecting you from the same mistake that nearly cost this family everything once before. This isn't about the company. This is about you being unable to imagine that I might want something you didn't choose for me. Love is not a luxury men like you get to indulge, Jinho. It's a liability with a headline attached." "Then I would rather have the liability," he said, "than another 15 years of feeling nothing at all." That confrontation should have been the emotional peak of the story, and in some ways, it was, but the truth beneath it was still buried, and it was about to surface in a way neither of them expected. Because Amara had not simply been a maid who happened to be fluent in Korean. Her father, before his death, had spent his final working years employed as a private technician for a small electronics repair contract, one that, unbeknownst to Amara, had been quietly subcontracted through a shell company controlled by Kong Industries during a period when the family was hiding assets from a hostile takeover investigation. The technician had seen documents he shouldn't have. He had died suddenly, officially of heart failure, and his daughter had spent 8 years believing it was simply exhaustion that killed him. It wasn't Madame CO who had ordered anything done to him, she was many things, but not that. It was her late husband's business partner, a man named Director O, who had spent a decade quietly consolidating power inside Kong Industries and who recognized Amara's surname the instant it appeared in the building's employee files, 3 weeks before Jinho ever heard her sing. Director O had been the one to leak her presence to the tabloids. Not out of loyalty to the family's reputation, but because a public scandal involving Jinho would destabilize the company at the exact moment O needed the board distracted to push through a vote that would hand him controlling influence. The headline broke on a Tuesday. Billionaire CEO's secret affair with former cleaning staff, and beneath it, buried in paragraph 6, a detail that made Amara's blood run cold. A mention of her father's name, his old employment history, and a suggestion vague, deniable, devastating that he had died under unexamined circumstances, connected to a company investigation 8 years prior. Everything she thought she understood about her own life rearranged itself in the space of one paragraph. Comment below if you saw that coming, because I promise you, the people who did are about to be just as unprepared for what happens next. And if you want to see how deep this goes, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part of this story moves fast, and I don't want you to miss a second of it. Amara went to Jinho that night, not for comfort, but for answers, and found him already waiting, phone in hand, face pale in a way she had never seen on him before. "Tell me it isn't true," she said. "I only just found out myself." His voice was low, urgent. "Amara, I swear to you, my mother had nothing to do with your father." "But Director O," he stopped, the pieces assembling themselves behind his eyes in real time. "O has been trying to destabilize this company for 2 years. If your father saw something in those subcontract files that O needed buried, then he had my father killed," Amara said, the words arriving flatter and colder than she expected, grief and fury arriving together and canceling each other into something almost calm. "And you've been sitting across a boardroom table from him for years." "I didn't know." "I believe you." And she did. That was the strange, unbearable part. She believed every word he said, and it changed nothing about the fact that the company bearing his name had, through negligence or worse, taken the last person who had ever loved her unconditionally, and she had spent 8 years mourning a heart attack that might never have happened on its own. The following 72 hours moved faster than either of them could control. O, sensing the investigation closing around him faster than anticipated, made his final move, leaking forged documents suggesting Jinho himself had orchestrated the affair as a publicity stunt to distract from quarterly losses. A lie so absurd it might have worked if Jinho hadn't spent his entire adult life being exactly the kind of man who would never need a publicity stunt to survive bad quarterly numbers. The board called an emergency session. Madame CO, who had spent the week in cold fury at her son, arrived at that session and did something no one, least of all Jinho, expected. She stood in front of the entire board and said that whatever her personal feelings about the timing, she had personally reviewed the subcontract files from 8 years prior, at her late husband's request, and that Director O's signature appeared on an authorization to terminate the contract of a technician who had become a liability, an authorization her husband had refused to countersign, and one O had apparently proceeded with regardless. "I did not know a man died," Madame CO said, and for the first time in the story, her voice cracked just slightly, just enough. "I would never have allowed that to stand unanswered. Whatever I think of my son's choices, I will not let this family's name shelter a murderer." O was removed from the board within the hour, the police were contacted by morning, and the investigation that followed confirmed what Amara had already known in her bones. Her father had discovered evidence of asset fraud, had been quietly and deliberately overworked into a health collapse by a man determined to silence him without leaving fingerprints, and had died believing it was simply his body giving out from years of sacrifice. The grief did not disappear when the truth arrived. If anything, it sharpened, because now she had a name to attach to 8 years of unanswered loss. But there was also, underneath the grief, something she hadn't expected to feel: a strange, exhausted relief. The relief of finally being believed, of no longer carrying a private, unprovable ache alone. If this story has made you feel even a fraction of what Amara felt in that moment, grief and relief tangled together, impossible to separate like this video now, because what happens in these final minutes is going to need every bit of that emotional investment you've built with us tonight. Jinho found her 3 days later, sitting alone in the small apartment she'd moved into after leaving the cleaning job, boxes half unpacked around her, a single photograph of her father propped against a lamp. "I came to say I understand if you can't look at me the same way," he said, standing awkwardly in her doorway, a man who commanded boardrooms suddenly unable to command a single sentence. "My family's negligence took your father from you. I don't expect." "You didn't take anything from me," Amara said, standing, closing the distance between them before her own fear could stop her. "A man who has been dead inside this company for years did that. You spent the last 2 weeks tearing your own family apart to get me the truth. That's not the same thing." "I need you to know something," Jinho said, and his voice, for the first time since she'd met him, had nothing guarded left in it at all. I have spent 15 years building a life designed so nothing could ever get close enough to hurt me again. And in the span of one lullaby, you got closer than anyone has in 15 years. I am not interested in protecting myself from that anymore. I would rather feel everything with you than feel nothing safely alone. Amara looked at him for a long moment, this man who had dismantled his own mother's carefully built empire of control in pursuit of a truth that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with basic human decency, and she understood, finally, that this was not a fairy tale about a poor girl catching a rich man's eye. It was something quieter and sturdier than that. It was two people who had each spent years disappearing into what other people needed from them, finally being seen, fully, by someone who wanted nothing from them except the truth. "Say the song again," she whispered. "Just once more. I want to hear what it sounds like now that we both know why it matters." He didn't sing it. His voice, he confessed, had never been good for anything but boardrooms, but he held her instead. And in the quiet of that small apartment, with boxes half unpacked and a father's photograph watching from the lamp table, Amara hummed the lullaby one more time. And for the first time since she was 17 years old, she did not feel like a woman disappearing. She felt entirely and finally like herself. Before we close this story out, I want you to subscribe. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that being truly seen is worth more than being comfortable. And tell me in the comments what's the biggest lesson you're taking from Amara and Jinho's story tonight. 6 months later, the Kong Foundation announced a new scholarship program for the children of immigrant workers in Seoul, named quietly, without fanfare, after a technician named Chidinma Emeka, a man the announcement described only as someone who taught us that dignity has no nationality, and that the truth, however long it takes, always finds its way home. Madam Seo attended the launch. So did Amara, no longer in a uniform, standing beside a man who had learned, finally, that the strongest kind of control is the choice to let yourself be loved without armor, and that some songs once sung can never be unheard, because they were never really about the melody at all. They were about being remembered, by someone who was listening closely enough to catch it.